Hello, Skeptical Heretic. I want to take some time to respond to your video to Libertarian Realist regarding race differences in intelligence. Although I do not speak for him, I do think that I can address some of your points from a racial hereditarian perspective. Before I start, I would like to thank you for making a civil video, which is not something I see very often on this topic. Libertarian Realist asked you for an estimate of the heritability of the black-white IQ gap. Your response was that you didn't understand the question, because, quote, an individual can't inherit a gap between two different groups of people. Well, nobody is claiming that. This appears to be a semantic misunderstanding. Heritability is about an explanation of variance, and functions at multiple levels of abstraction. When we ask what the general heritability of a trait is, we are asking how much of the observed variation within a given population is due to variation in genes. We can ask this same question on the group level, and this is not a technique specific to the hereditarians. This is a mainstream scientific concept. Coming from a random page from the UC Boulder Psychology Department, quote, between group heritability pertains to differences between populations. It is an index of the extent to which genes contribute to the differences in population means. So the question still stands. About what proportion of the black-white IQ gap within the present-day U.S. do you estimate to be due to genetic differences? Surely you could indulge us by providing a rough estimate. In his video, Libertarian Realist asserted that blacks in the United States are not impoverished, and there are whites who do live in extreme poverty. You respond by asking him what he means by extreme poverty, which is a fine question to ask. You then provide a working definition of poverty in the United States, and point out that blacks disproportionately fall below the poverty line relative to whites. Because of this, you assert that, quote, we can't eliminate poverty as a factor here. In fact, it is very easy to eliminate poverty as an explanation. To do this, we must first put income variation within the United States into perspective. This is best done with a few key data points. First, the bottom 5% of Americans have an average income that puts them at about the 68th percentile for the entire world. That's a staggering amount of wealth. For comparison, the bottom 5% of Americans have an average income higher than the top 5% in India, and they stand at about the 80th percentile with respect to residents of China. When we talk about the 47 million Americans who are, quote, living in poverty, we must keep in mind that we are describing a group of people who, for the most part, have a purchasing power and standard of living that is far above what most human beings on this earth enjoy. U.S. income inequality having been put into perspective, we can look at race differences across income levels to rule out poverty as an explanation. The takeaway point from this data is best summarized by Linda Gottfredson in her editorial Mainstream Science on Intelligence, which has 52 signatories from those in the field of intelligence research. Quote, racial ethnic differences are somewhat smaller but still substantial for individuals from the same socioeconomic backgrounds. To illustrate, black students from prosperous families tend to score higher in IQ than blacks from poor families, but they score no higher, on average, than whites from poor families. For a concrete example of this fact, we can look at race differences in SAT scores, which in practice are almost identical to IQ scores. White students from impoverished families have a higher average SAT score than black students from the highest income groups, or over $100,000 per year. By itself, that one statistic should be sufficient to rule out poverty as an explanation for low black IQ. We can also break down the data by family education level. White test takers from families with only a high school education outperform blacks from families with graduate degrees. The consistent trend here is that race differences trump class differences, by any measure. Another way of separating correlation from causation is by tracking individuals of different IQ over the course of their lives, and noting the income they earn. Charles Murray did exactly this, using data from the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth from 1978 to 1993. As young adults, groups with different IQ start out very close in terms of their income. It is only later in life that they begin to stratify in income along lines of intelligence. This suggests that it is differences in intelligence that lead to people having different incomes over the course of their lives, and is evidence against the equalitarian belief that it is income differences that are driving IQ differences. None of this is to say that income and poverty don't matter at all. Certainly, a child that is malnourished or has poor health care will not develop to his full potential. However, the United States does not exhibit the extreme variation in environments that we might see in the world at large. Heritability is about accounting for observed variation. If, for example, blacks in the United States had their incomes cut in half overnight, and they remained that way, then in subsequent years we would likely conclude that the heritability of the black-white IQ gap had fallen to some degree. This is because heritability is not a global figure, it is context-sensitive. However, saying that poverty can have an effect at the extreme end of the distribution does not prove that poverty is having a substantial effect on group differences within first world countries. When the hereditarian says that socioeconomic status is not a significant contributor to the one standard deviation mean IQ difference between blacks and whites in the US, what we are saying is that the current variations in SES do not account for the current variations in IQ performance. This makes it highly plausible that the remaining racial disparities are due to genetic factors. The hereditarian theory becomes even more probable when we consider some of the other studies that have been done on environment, such as transracial adoption studies or early childhood intervention studies, all of which reinforce the view that a deprived environment is not at fault for poor black performance. All of these points should be sufficient to rule out most environmental explanations for the black-white IQ gap. I think that to an impartial observer, these should make a very compelling case for the hereditarian view of race differences. Now I would like to respond to one particular piece of evidence you present, which is variation in Human Development Index rankings between states. You submit this as evidence of a wide range of economic and educational opportunities within the US. I have a separate video about the HDI, which I will link to in my sources. The main issue with this metric is that it assumes the conclusions it is usually being used to prove. One problem is that it makes no attempt to control for cultural factors that influence its key components, such as life expectancy. As I point out in my previous video on the matter, life expectancy rankings can change dramatically when we control for factors such as drug use, homicides, and so forth. Homicides in particular are very relevant in the context of this discussion, considering that the number one predictor of a state's violent crime rate is not poverty, unemployment, or education, but simply how many black people you have. Blacks engage in violent crime at about 7 to 9 times the rate of whites, and this gap persists even when controlling for socioeconomic status. Also, as I have demonstrated, blacks have lower educational achievement even when controlling for environment. Hopefully you can see how these would present a problem for using the HDI, which heavily weighs life expectancy and educational achievement to measure a region's development. This doesn't mean the HDI is useless, but if you are trying to use it to prove that a deprived environment is depressing IQ scores, you are essentially begging the question because it is very difficult to disentangle correlation and causation. The evidence I presented previously, however, does control for environment and suggests that black IQ scores are only slightly depressed by these factors. You assert that there is a wide variation in educational systems within the United States. This is something of a red herring. There is significant variation in educational outcomes across the U.S., but this appears to be due in large part to variation in student ability between schools and school districts. That is, smart students tend to attend the same schools, creating the perception that school quality matters. But if we track students between schools, or changes in the school environment across time, the impact of the educational environment goes away almost entirely. Some of the most compelling evidence in this area comes from studies of the recent experiments in school voucher programs. These vouchers are usually targeted at low-income or minority students, and because they are often allocated based on a random lottery, they provide a natural controlled experiment in school quality. The almost universal finding of these studies is that students who get transferred to the, quote, good schools see little to no improvements in performance relative to a control group. Another observation against the theory of deprived educational environments is the complete inability of funding increases to raise student achievement. Since the 1970s, inflation-adjusted per-pupil public school spending has more than tripled. Despite this, there has been no increase in average student performance on standardized tests. This, too, suggests that a lack of resources or investment education is not to blame for the persistent underachievement of certain groups. Lastly, we can look at the Head Start program, an initiative whose deliberate aim is to increase the achievement of disadvantaged and minority groups. This program is big business. To date, it has cost more money than the entire Apollo program, and currently consumes approximately $9 billion per year, which is about $9,000 per student involved in the program. That's quite a large chunk of money. For perspective, I attended a very nice, well-performing private school here in Austin, Texas, for most of my early education, and our tuition was only about half of that. Despite this significant resource commitment specifically targeted at helping disadvantaged students, there have been absolutely no lasting impacts attributable to this intervention. The Department of Health and Human Services conducted a systematic study of the program, examining over 100 outcome metrics. They were unable to find a single variable in which there was a statistically significant lasting impact of the program on the students. This is a massive, spectacular failure, and was a true embarrassment for those involved in this very costly intervention program. When we consider all this evidence together, the picture becomes very clear. I am not saying that educational spending doesn't matter at all, or that there are no improvements to be made. What I am saying is that, as was the case with socioeconomic status, the current variation in school quality cannot account for the observed variation in student achievement. Overwhelmingly, it is the quality of the student, not the quality of the school, that is the limiting factor in the United States. Let's bring all this back around to the question of race differences. Are black students disproportionately stuck in underfunded schools, or otherwise deprived of educational resources and opportunities? There is plenty of reason to believe that this is not the case. As early as 1966, the now famous Coleman Report, commissioned by the Department of Education to investigate school equality in accordance with the Civil Rights Act of 1964, concluded that, on average, black schools had per-pupil funding equal to that of white schools, even in the South. Instead, the composition of the student body was the best predictor of educational outcomes. James Coleman was not a hereditarian, and attributed these differences to socioeconomic status and a need for environmental improvements, explanations that I contend have failed for the reasons that I have just mentioned. Half a century later, with decades of programs and hundreds of billions of dollars devoted to the explicit cause of eliminating the despised achievement gap, no progress has been made. The present-day IQ gap remains unchanged, despite a myriad of policy interventions dedicated to improving black environments. Your assertion, skeptical heretic, that a deprived educational environment can't be eliminated as a cause of the IQ gap fails totally and goes against available evidence. You then state that we are unable to perfectly control for environment, and we are therefore unable to isolate the genetic component of racial IQ gaps. It is true that we will never be able to perfectly control for all environmental variables. However, I would contend that we are able to come pretty close. Controlling for family income, education, breastfeeding, and all of the other environmental explanations put forward by the equalitarians has failed to substantially reduce the IQ gap. More importantly, however, even though we can't specifically isolate every single factor that goes into IQ gaps, it is possible, through statistical inference, to estimate the heritability of group differences to a satisfactory degree of accuracy. One such method is to look at subtest heritability. Some components of mental testing are known to be more heritable than others. This knowledge can be used to help understand the nature of group differences. If the black-white IQ gap is largely due to genetic factors, then we would expect that the magnitude of the race gaps would be positively correlated with the heritability of a test component. And indeed, this is precisely what we find. Philip Rushton has performed this analysis with some of his own IQ data, and from his analysis we can estimate the heritability of the black-white IQ gap to be about 75 to 80% in the US. Perhaps you may not trust Rushton, and that's fine, but this analysis can be replicated by anyone with a copy of Excel if you feel his conclusions are biased. Other researchers have replicated his findings on other datasets. Another method of inferring heritability is to look at regression to the mean. It is known that extreme instances of polygenic traits tend to regress towards the group mean in the next generation. By observing the magnitude and degree of regression, we can infer the genetic population mean of a trait within a certain range of environments. IQ is no exception, and it is known that both high and low IQ tends to regress to the mean, both in parent-offspring pairs and in between siblings. However, blacks and whites do not regress to the same mean. Using data from the NSLY, Rushton and Jensen demonstrate that a black parent of IQ 105 will have children of average IQ 95, halfway between the extreme trait and the racial mean. A white parent of same IQ will have children of average IQ 102, again halfway between the extreme trait and the racial mean. This provides compelling evidence that the black-white IQ gap in the United States is almost entirely due to genetic variation. environmental explanations for the observed regression is almost impossible. The culture-only theorist could plausibly argue that environmental forces systematically raise white IQ and/or depress black IQ. However, this explanation is thwarted by the fact that IQ regression occurs in equal proportion in both the positive and negative direction, and for both races. That is, the same regression that is observed pulling down high-end blacks and raising low-end whites also appears to be equally effective at raising low-end blacks and lowering high-end whites. Genetic theory is thoroughly vindicated by this result, and there is almost no wiggle room left for environmental explanations for the observed group differences. I will also note that, again, you may not like Rushton or Jensen, but any bias in their results is highly unlikely, because essentially all they did was graph results from an already existing public dataset. So, while you are correct to point out that we have no perfect controls for environment, your high degree of skepticism on this question is unwarranted. Although we should always be looking to increase our knowledge on this subject, there is plenty of reason to accept the figure of about 0.8 for the heritability of race differences within the United States. Now, libertarian realist asserted that the heritability of the black-white IQ gap is certainly going to be greater than 0%, to which you responded that nobody was claiming otherwise. Your implication is that libertarian realist is arguing against a straw man. To start with, I would like to point out that Evogen is one prominent user here involved in this discussion who has explicitly stated that he is taking the 0% heritability position with respect to race differences in IQ. So yes, some people are arguing this. As for yourself, I'm not sure I've heard you explicitly state that you were arguing for 0% heritability. However, based on your past behavior, this would be a highly reasonable conclusion to draw about your position. In the past, you have criticized racial hereditarians as being racists, who argued their position out of a false sense of superiority. Your different stance on this issue didn't appear to just be one of degree. I think most people who have been the subject of such attacks would reasonably infer that you were arguing from the position of total racial equality with respect to IQ. Now, you say that this is not your position, and I think that's great. However, it would be even better if you could give us your best guess as to what the heritability figure is for the US black-white IQ gap. I don't think it does us any good to keep repeating that, well, we don't know for sure, and never draw any conclusions. In response to the claim by libertarian realist that the present variation in environment cannot account for race differences in IQ, especially considering the 0.75 general heritability of IQ, you state that, quote, "The biggest problem with your hypothesis is that if environment has a very weak interaction with IQ, then why do we see the constant upward march in IQ scores year after year?" A good question, but part of the answer can actually be found in the very Flynn-Dickens paper you cited, in which the authors make clear that high heritability estimates are entirely consistent with high environmental impacts on IQ across time. Again, this makes sense when we recognize that heritability is merely an explanation of variance in a certain population at a certain time. Heritability could be as high as 0.9, and still allow for a huge environmental impact on overall IQ scores across time. Flynn and Dickens state the question far more eloquently. Quote, "For all group differences, this analysis poses the question: if the observed variance in environment accounts for so little variance in adult IQ, how could environmental factors cause large differences? How can this paradox be resolved? One could challenge existing heritability estimates. However, a committee of highly respected researchers convened by the American Psychological Association concluded that, by late adolescence, heritability is around 0.75. Future research may change this value, but we do not choose to dispute it. We suspect that when the dust settles, the value for heritability in adults will be high enough to allow Jensen to make his argument." The paper then goes on to provide a model that allows for the so-called Flynn effect while preserving high heritability estimates. So consider what they are saying here. They are explicitly stating that they are accepting the APA 0.75 figure, and state that not only do they believe adult IQ heritability to be close to this figure, but they go so far as to say that, quote, "when the dust settles, Arthur Jensen and Charles Murray will still be able to make their argument with respect to racial hereditarianism." Now, outside of these paragraphs, it is true that Flynn and Dickens take a more environmental view of race differences, but they clearly are allowing for hereditarianism. Just as a side note, I find it amusing that, in a video ostensibly arguing for a sort of IQ agnosticism, where you say we don't have enough evidence to make any claims regarding a heritability figure, you cite a paper in which Flynn and Dickens state that it is quite reasonable to estimate heritability, specifically saying that it is probably at least 0.6 or around 0.75. The paradox you present is easily resolved through a simple analogy that abstracts away from the current race debate. Consider a world in which, say, variation in life expectancy is almost entirely heritable. Group A and Group B differ genetically in a way that allows for Group A to live 10% longer on average than Group B. Over the course of a century, industrialized agriculture allows for the average lifespan to increase by 50%. However, Group A maintains a 10% lead across this entire period. If there is a general increase in living standards across time, you can imagine how, if we examined a cross-section of the population at any given year, the heritability could be as high as 100%, while still allowing for environmentally driven shifts up or down for the population as a whole. In the context of the race debate, it is entirely possible for us to make the following two statements. 1. For all individuals within the United States, genetic variation accounts for about 75% of the observed variation in IQ scores for any given year in the past 3 decades. 2. Over the past 3 decades, average IQ scores have risen by about 2.5 to 3 points per decade. These two statements are wholly compatible with each other, because the primarily environmental factors that are responsible for the overall increase in IQ are not necessarily crowding out the primarily genetic factors that account for IQ variation among individuals and groups at any given time. This isn't a zero-sum game. Both explanations have their place in the discussion. In their 2010 response to Flynn and Dickens, Rushton and Jensen make exactly this sort of argument, demonstrating that the Flynn effect does not provide good reason to expect any narrowing of the black-white IQ gap. Through factor analysis, they demonstrate that the nature of the observed increase in IQ scores over time differs from the nature of the remaining race gaps. Specifically, they show that observed component IQ gains are either not correlated or are negatively correlated with G loadings in inbreeding depression scores. By contrast, these correlations are significantly positive within black-white IQ differences. To put it another way, the general increase in IQ scores of about 3 points per decade has been on the least heritable non-G-loaded subtests, and as such does not necessarily translate into any increase in, quote, real intelligence. By contrast, the black-white IQ gap persists on the most heritable, most G-loaded test components, and we can see this as being far more substantial and relevant to achievement in the real world. In this way, Rushton and Jensen convincingly argue that we should not expect to see any decrease in the black-white IQ gap because of our observation of the Flynn effect. As they state in their conclusion, quote, predictions about the black-white IQ gap narrowing due to the secular rise is based on faith rather than evidence. There is no more reason to expect black-white differences in IQ to narrow as a result of the secular rise in IQ than to expect male-female differences in height to narrow as a result of the secular rise in height. The mostly heritable cause of the one is not necessarily the mostly environmental cause of the other. So, paradox resolved. There are a couple other relevant points from the Rushton-Jensen editorial that merit inclusion here. First, they provide one plausible non-environmental explanation for the secular rise in IQ. As they point out, quote, tests lose their G-loadedness over time as a result of training, retesting, and familiarity. They provide a citation to that effect, which you can see in their article if you are more interested in the inner workings of IQ testing. Second, Rushton and Jensen contest the Flynn-Dickens assertion that there has been a narrowing of the black-white IQ gap. They criticize Flynn for not including the data that did not support his conclusion, as well as for exaggerating gains with an extrapolated trend line. They demonstrate, using data from the 1954 California Achievement Test to the 1966 Coleman Report to the currently available NAEP data, that there has been no decrease in the IQ gap, and little to no decrease in the achievement gap. However, most researchers involved would agree that any gap closing that has been observed has been small, and there has been either no observed narrowing or even a slight gap widening since about 1990. All these other issues aside, the dichotomy you present in your video is a false one. No hereditarians involved in this discussion would dispute that there can be a, quote, wide-ranging environmental effect upon IQ. Our position is that these environmental effects do not account for race gaps within the U.S. Libertarian Realist, in his video, provided some evidence for the consistency of racial IQ gaps within the United States, and asked you for evidence to support your proposition that the race gap is narrowing. And you did provide a link to one Dutch study, which you did not summarize in your video. I read through much, though not all of the study, and I have to say that I do not think it supports the conclusion you are trying to make. The hereditarian conclusion is that there has been little to no narrowing of IQ gaps for native populations within the United States, or in the first world generally. The study you cited, although quite interesting, was discussing changes in IQ gaps between non-native immigrant populations from the first to the second generation. No hereditarian would deny that, for immigrant populations from impoverished nations, that there remain substantial environmental improvements that can reduce their IQ gap relative to the native population. Nor would we deny that there would be substantial improvements for their native-born children, who can develop to their full potential within a first-world environment. None of this, however, has any bearing on the point of contention, which is not about gains for immigrants, but rather about what potential there is for narrowing the existing cognitive gaps between native-born English-speaking residents within the first world. The racial hereditarian will contend that the black-white IQ gap observed within the United States is more or less permanent and will not go away. However, it would not be any threat to the hereditarian worldview for a black man born in sub-Saharan Africa to see substantial gains in IQ after immigrating to the United States. It would also come as no surprise that any children he has in the U.S. will close the gap even further. None of this would change the hereditarian's position on the nature and permanence of the black-white IQ gap within the U.S. This is because the high heritability of a developed nation cannot be applied to the world at large, as the wide range of environments would overwhelm genetic differences. No hereditarian claims otherwise. There are a couple other reasons why this study does not apply to the current conversation. First, the study acknowledges that not all of the gap narrowing is necessarily due to environmental improvements, because the immigrant populations in question are a non-representative sample. Specifically, the immigrants in question were disproportionately low IQ with respect to their population mean. Because of this, we would fully expect for their IQs to rise in the next generation due to regression to the mean, an entirely genetic phenomenon as I have previously described. Another important factor in this sort of immigrant study is the effect of overcoming the language barrier. Some of the measures used in the study had a language bias, so the increased and measured general intelligence could be overstated because of the fade-out of the language barrier over time and between generations. The effect is not huge, and the authors do make efforts to control for it, but it bears mention anyway. As we can see, even a cursory familiarity with this study reveals that it is ill-suited to the present conversation. However, in an almost eerily prescient section of the study, the authors seem to have known that their findings would be misused in the way that you are doing. From their conclusions, under the heading Comparison with U.S. Findings, the authors had this to say, quote, "Our findings do not show the same pattern as U.S. findings concerning black-white or Hispanic-white differences. With concern to educational achievement, narrowing stopped during the 1980s and started to widen again during the 1990s. With concern to G, Lin finds no support for diminishing group differences, and Jensen and Neisser conclude that there is no convincing evidence that group differences are diminishing. The racial IQ gap has stubbornly held at one standard deviation as long as records have been kept. We conclude that in the Netherlands, the diminishment of group differences in educational achievement is accompanied by clearly diminishing group differences in G, but this closing of the gap in G does not take place in the U.S. I think we can safely say that this paragraph is very unflattering for your assertions. Libertarian Realist asked you to provide evidence for your claim that IQ scores were converging for racial groups, specifically in the context of blacks, whites, and Hispanics in the United States. You then cite this paper, which not only does not apply to the type of population trends we are talking about, but specifically says their findings do not apply to IQ gaps within the United States, and goes out of its way to provide evidence for the manifest permanence of racial gaps between blacks and whites in the U.S. It could not be any clearer to me, Skeptical Heretic, that you are not vetting your sources thoroughly. I don't know if this was just a mistake, or if you knew about it and hoped nobody would notice. In either case, you are making some rather broad assertions, and you are doing so on a very shaky foundation that threatens to fall apart upon further scrutiny. One last note about this study. As I was writing this, I noticed that the lead author of this paper is actually the same person I hinted at previously, whom Rushton and Jensen favorably cited for evidence that the secular rise in IQ scores over time was partially due to test familiarity and the diminishing G-loading of tests, as opposed to being proof of environmental gains. So you can take that for whatever you think that's worth, but it's just another hint that you need to check your sources, because both the author you link to and Arthur Jensen are proponents of racial hereditarianism, who favorably cite each other's papers. There are a few other small points before I bring this to a close. You criticize the Minnesota twin study because there was confounding due to some of the twins having been reunited before the study. I would agree that this is a problem that should be looked into. However, I don't think that this confounder is sufficient to dismiss the conclusions from the study regarding the heritability of intelligence. In fact, in the article you link to from American Renaissance, a prominent hereditarian-leaning organization, the authors specifically note this source of criticism and address it. They write that, quote, "There was considerable variation in the amount of time twin pairs had been reunited before Mishra tested them, and critics complained that this gave them time to study each other and to become more similar. In fact, this variable made it possible to test whether time spent together before testing really did make twins more similar. In fact, it did not." So, although you do make a valid point about this being a potential source of confounding, the authors of the study already saw it coming and concluded that there was no effect. This makes sense when we look deeper into the results of the study. The twins were most similar, not on those aspects of themselves over which they had conscious control, but on the most innate aspects of their cognitive abilities. The degree of similarity for twins was highly correlated with the G-loading of mental tests, which are the portions of testing least swayed by training or intervention, a fact I learned after reading about the Dutch author you so kindly cited in your video. I already expressed my frustration with your stubborn agnosticism on the topic of heritability. You are correct that we do not know with certainty the impact of every gene or every environmental toxin with respect to IQ differences. However, I would contend that we have enough data at our fingertips to make a very well-informed guess. Having said that, I think that we have quite a few misunderstandings to clear up before we can get on the same page with respect to IQ heritability. Having gone over your video and the sources you cite, I find it difficult to believe that you completely understand the position of your opponents. I would appreciate your response and clarification on the issues I have raised here. Thank you for your time.